Welcome to the Tri-Cities Creation Science Club, and it's good to be back in the saddle again. Of course, not in the capacity that I would like to be in. We obviously are not in the church gym at Temple Baptist, but we are here in my classroom, Mark's Academy of Science. And of course, as you see behind me here, we got a lot of rocks and fossils and, gems and things like that. And then in front of me here, we've got fossils. And anyway, what these rocks and fossils represent is a result of Noah's flood. This is a result of catastrophism. And, the interesting thing is, you look at these rocks and they're really beautiful. They're amazing to look at. And it captures most people's attention. Most people will look at a rock and they will think, wow, that's just amazing. That is like in the ground or in the rocks, you'll find rocks in the rocks. You'll find thunder eggs and geodes and amethyst and all these kind of neat things. And most of them are here because of hydrothermal activity, which comes from volcanism and lava flows and that kind of stuff. And so, when you dig up a rock for the first time, you got to realize you are touching it for the first time, probably since the flood. Most of your rocks and fossils are either a direct result of the flood or an indirect result of the flood. And so when you dig up a rock or you dig up a fossil, especially a fossil, most likely whatever fossil you dig up was alive during Noah's time. And that's really something to think about. That's amazing. That's supposed to be amazing. Okay, that should amaze you. That should impress you. And anyway, today we're going to talk about Mount St. Helens, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, because Mount St. Helens became a geological laboratory for the study of Noah's flood. And of course, as you know, Mount St. Helens erupted May 18th, 1980, and here we are, May 18th, 2020, 40 years later. And I've been on 2 field trips to Mount St. Helens, both conducted by Dr. Steve Austin, who is a geologist, and those were great, memorable times going on those field trips and being able to hike down the blast zone. And we got to hike into places where the regular person is not allowed to go into and see these places. And I'm going to take you to some of these places. And I'm hoping that this presentation is only going to be about 30 to 45 minutes. That's really about all that I can do. I'm going to edit it, of course, once I'm done. And I like to make things good. And so, anyway, the eruption of Mount St. Helens had some theological implications to it as well. We're not just talking about scientific implications, theological implications. And especially nowadays. Now, the whole world is in a mess. We're panicking over this virus, and it's worldwide, and a lot of people now are starting to talk about Bible prophecy more. And of course, some people are a little bit timid about it because, after all, there's been people who've made multitudes of mistakes making predictions about the Lord's coming and sensationalizing Bible prophecy. And so the easily offended people, they get offended by that, and then they don't want to talk about Bible prophecy at all. And you can't really talk about creation and not talk about Bible prophecy, and you can't talk about Bible prophecy without talking about creation. And so we're going to talk about both. But first we're going to talk about the theological implications that lead us to Bible prophecy. Because, if you were alive when I was alive, May 18th, 1980, or just before that, that the Washington State government, and especially the governor and the state patrol, the Forest Service, scientists, everybody was warning the people to stay away from Mount St. Helens. You see, it's really interesting how people were talking back then, because they were basically talking about, or they were talking like the Bible talks about the coming of the Lord. Because all these important people, all these professional people and law enforcement, they were all saying, you know, we don't know the day or the hour when the mountain is going to erupt, but we're getting closer. Every day is getting closer to the eruption. See, they all knew it was going to erupt. There was no doubt about that. No doubt about it whatsoever. And there was like little mini tremors. There was like little mini eruptions. I believe it was like in March and April. All these little mini eruptions. And here's the interesting thing. Because I had really kept track of all this stuff that was going on. And so here I am in my bedroom just before church. May 18th, about 8:30. Now the mountain erupted about 8:32, 8:33 in the morning. So here I am. I'm right there in my bedroom with the radio on. It's about 8:30, and I hear the news come on, and they say Mount St. Helens erupted. And you know, when they said that about Mount St. Helens erupting, I really didn't pay any attention to it, because I had heard the news say before that Mount St. Helens had erupted, like in March and April. They were the little mini eruptions, so I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. And I thought, you know, that's exactly the way it's going to be when Jesus comes back. It's like the Bible says, you know, in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 3, it says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." You know, the Lord is going to come back as a thief in the night. He's going to surprise everybody. It's just like when Mount St. Helens erupted for real, it really surprised me. It shocked me. I had heard about all this stuff before, about the mountain erupted, but I just didn't pay a lot of attention to it when it finally erupted. You could say that when the mountain finally really erupted, it was kind of like a thief, except it wasn't stealing anything, but it was blowing everything up, and as a result 56 people lost their lives. And that's another thing we want to talk about here in just a minute. And then in verse 3 it says, "For when they shall say peace and safety." Now, aren't people talking a lot about that nowadays? They're talking about safety. They're saying, well, we're going to pass a law for your safety. Well, we need to do this for your safety, and you need to stay home for your safety. And we're just all here for your safety. You know, the government's talking about it. The news media is talking about it. Probably where you work, they're talking about it. Everybody's talking about safety and peace. And yet, there's no safety. And it seems like the more they talk about peace and safety, the worse it gets. The more desperate people are getting, the more angry people are getting, the more suspicious people are getting. You know, it's almost like this country is about ready to have a civil war or something. You know, I mean, it's crazy. And so anyway, in verse 3 it says, "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." Now let's talk about Mount St. Helens. See, all the authorities were saying, we don't know the day or the hour when the mountain's going to blow up, but we know it's going to blow up. We know it's coming. And the authorities, they were looking at the birth pangs of the mountain. As time went on, the mountain rumbled more and more. The earthquakes were getting bigger, and the mountain erupted a couple of times before the major eruption. Well, here's the thing. Here's what's really interesting. The whole time, the people in authority were saying, stay away from the mountain. Okay? Now get this. I believe it was the day before the mountain erupted, May 17th. The sun came out. There wasn't a wind. There wasn't hardly a breeze. Everything just seemed so perfect and peaceful. And people were going like, you know, you people have been talking about the mountain erupting for a long time. And now here it is. It's just a beautiful day. It's calm. There's no rain. There's no wind. And then, just a few hours later, just the next day, in the morning, at 8:32, the people were not heeding the authorities' warning, and they all went out to play. They all went out to do whatever. They didn't listen to the people in authority. And as a result, 56 people died. It was around 56. Now, isn't that amazing? How we can take the eruption of Mount St. Helens, apply it to Bible prophecy. We can take Noah's flood and apply it to Bible prophecy. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that out. And now we're going to talk about the scientific implications of Mount St. Helens. And then we will talk more again about, you know, the people that died that didn't need to die. And it's just like today, you know, we've got a few good preachers out there. We've got teachers out there that are telling people, you know, Christ is coming. We don't know the day or the hour. But when he does come, it's going to take everybody by surprise. It's just going to shock people out of their gourd. The only way I know how to put it. And so, okay, so anyway, let's now get into the main body of our lesson. Okay, I have one announcement to make. There's going to be a field trip at Mount St. Helens, August 18th through the 22nd, about 5 days. And there's going to be several hikes, and it's being put out by Living Waters Bible Camp, place back east somewhere. I don't know much about them, but anyway, you'll want to go on their website, and it is lwbc.org, lwbc.org. And they have invited about 5 or 6 people to come and speak. And of course, the main one will be Dr. Steve Austin, and he is the guy who is mostly responsible for doing all the scientific investigation there at Mount St. Helens after the eruption of May 18th, 1980, discovering that it is a geological laboratory for the study of Noah's flood. So that has been really exciting to learn all that stuff, and that's what this presentation is going to be about, of course. And so, you know, look, if you can make it to that, that would be great. If you had the time and the money to go on that field trip. When I saw the dates, it just about killed me. I thought, oh no, because I wanted to go, and I'm already taken up for that week. I've already got things going, and I'm just not going to be able to make it unless the Lord works some kind of a miracle, which I wished he would. Because I would love to go there. There's just nothing like going on a field trip there at Mount St. Helens. And you really need to get there as soon as you can. If you've never been there, it is one of the most amazing places to see what that mountain did when it erupted like that. It created the biggest landslide in recorded history, and there's just so much to see there, so much to do. And you'll be around and you get to fellowship with a lot of really neat people. It's always a lot of fun to go on those field trips. I've been on 2 of them. I was on the first field trip that Steve Austin did in 1990, and I tell you, I just had the time of my life. And so anyway, here's the big question. Where were you when the mountain blew? I was in my bedroom getting ready for church, and it was just after 8:32, and I was listening to the radio, and the news came on, and they said, well, Mount St. Helens had just erupted, and I really didn't listen to that a whole lot because it had already erupted a couple of times, but those were little mini eruptions, and I guess I just didn't listen to the finer details. So I went to church, and the pastor gave a lesson on the book of Revelation, and by about 11:30, it had gotten completely dark, and we're all kind of looking around. You know, we had to turn on the lights, and we stepped outside, and lo and behold, you should have seen these weird, ominous-looking clouds. It looked like fingers sticking out of the sky. You know, it was dark. You know, day had turned to dark, and that was just really amazing. And I just thought, you know, it's amazing that the pastor would pick a subject on Revelation at a time like that. And anyway, there were people all over eastern Washington that heard the mountain go off, but it sounded like a sonic boom. And so a lot of people didn't know what was going on until, of course, it got dark. And so I remember my dad saying that, well, we've got to go out in the field and we've got to move water. You know, these hand lines, you know, that go for a couple hundred yards. And we had to move all this water when the ash was coming down like snow, and I'm not sure why we had to do that, because it's normally we don't do that, but it had something to do with the ash fall or whatever, and he thought we needed to get out there and we need to change all the water and stuff. So anyway, I don't want to be disrespectful for the 56 people that got killed as a result of that eruption, and then all the families that were affected by that. And I always want to, you know, remember not to sound too disrespectful, because in my world and my end of things over here in Eastern Washington, I was thinking, man, this is really amazing. You know, I've never got to see a volcano go off, but I thought, at least I'm living through this. You know, I just, you know, being 15 years old, and I like adventure. I like to see cool things. I like to experience really neat things and adventuresome things. And I just thought, man, this is really neat. And then at the time, we didn't realize that God was going to use a man mightily in all of this. His name is Dr. Steve Austin, whom I just mentioned. And he is the guy who is largely responsible for doing most all the scientific research there at Mount St. Helens, and teaching us that it would become a geologic laboratory for Noah's flood, for the study of Noah's flood. And so the things that you would be learning on that field trip, and the things you're going to be learning in this presentation, is how the eruption of Mount St. Helens proved that the Grand Canyon was not carved out over millions of years by the Colorado River. And so see, this completely revolutionized geology. Now, of course, now don't expect the evolutionists to admit to this. They're not going to, because, well, you know, evolution is a worldview, and they're not going to let go of their worldview, and they're going to try to pass it off as science. They're going to, you know, evolution masquerades as science. And other things that we learned from the eruption of Mount St. Helens is about petrified forests. We're finding out that all these petrified forests around the world are not really petrified forests at all. They never were necessarily a forest, but what happened was that Mount St. Helens, when it erupted, this huge landslide came off the mountain, hit Spirit Lake. All the water rushed up on the other side of the mountain, uprooted all those trees, brought all the trees back into the lake like a bathtub, you know? Like when you take a bath, well, nobody takes a bath anymore. You know, we take showers. So, but back in the good old days, when we did take a bath, you know, you fill up the tub with water, and then you jump in it, and all the water sloshes out. And you think about Spirit Lake being like that, uprooting all those trees. Tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of trees, uprooting them and bringing them back into the lake. And now those trees are getting waterlogged, and they are floating to the bottom of the lake, and some of those trees are replanting themselves. Well, we're discovering that that's basically what happened in all these other petrified forests throughout the world, that that they did not slowly over millions of years get petrified. They were actually catastrophically uprooted and then buried, and then they became petrified, and then another event comes along and exposes those logs, like at the famous petrified forest in Arizona, the Arizona Petrified Forest. And then, of course, we have one of the top 10 petrified forests in the world right here in Washington State, because there has been about 50 different kinds of petrified trees from around the world right here, about an hour from here. So that's, you know, that's really amazing. Of course, those trees, they're in pillow basalt, so it's a little bit different deal, but the fact is that they were covered up catastrophically. And these are all the things we're going to talk about in our presentation today. And then the other thing we learned about is how coal is made. We discovered that through the eruption of Mount St. Helens, that it doesn't take millions of years to form coal. The correct events of Mount St. Helens actually made it possible now for the formation of coal. But what we need is another eruption or something to bury all those trees and the stuff that came off those trees when they're bumping together, you know, floating around, and then it all slowly goes to the bottom of the lake. So we just need another eruption or some type of catastrophe to bury all that stuff, to create enough heat to create coal. Okay, and then we also learned about how badlands are formed. And so those are some of the things that we are going to learn about, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. Well, here's what the mountain looked like May 18th, 1980. You can see it's a beautiful conical shaped type mountain, and you can see Spirit Lake there in the front. And you know, it was a beautiful sunshiny morning, and people forgot about all the warnings. You know, the mountain is going to blow. We don't know the day or the hour when it's going to go, but it's going to blow sooner or later. And so people, they did not heed the warnings, and they went out to recreate, and as a result, the mountain, it blew up, and it killed like something like 56 people, something like that. And there you look at the pre-eruption mountain and then the post-eruption mountain. When Mount St. Helens blew, the pre-eruption, I believe it was like 9,677 feet, and then it blew about 1,200 feet off of that on May 18th, 1980. And so, yeah, it was a beautiful day just before it blew up. And there is the post-eruption look, and you notice all the logs in Spirit Lake there. In fact, you can't even tell if that's even a lake, but there is a lake right there in front of the mountain, and the lake is covered by about 1 million logs. They say about 3.2 billion board feet of trees that slid into the lake as a result of the eruption. And so here are some of the pictures that was taken about 11 miles away at Bare Meadows from a guy by the name of Keith Ronholm. And so he took about 10 pictures, and in about 11 seconds, that the steam explosion, all that steam and ash was coming right at him, and he just barely escaped with his life. And so there was an earthquake about 5.2 on the Richter scale, and as a result, it produced the greatest landslide in recorded history, and all this mud and dirt went into Spirit Lake. It would be kind of like if you jumped into a bathtub, hit that bathtub hard, all this water sloshed out, and as a result, it hit all the trees on the other side of the mountain, uprooted all of them, and slid all those trees into Spirit Lake. And so you have this mudslide coming down, and then you have all this steam, and it's rushing towards Bare Meadows at about 200 miles an hour. The steam is 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and this guy, Keith Ronholm, he just started taking pictures, click, 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 and he just barely escaped with his life. And so anyway, this is the north slope of Mount St. Helens erupting, and it was kind of like when you shake up a bottle, you know, it's got all that fizz in there, and it pops the cork after there's so much pressure. And scientists, they were watching this mountain before it erupted, and they noticed this bulge that was growing on the side of the north side of Mount St. Helens, and it was growing 3 to 5 feet a day. And then finally there was this earthquake, 5.2 on the Richter scale, and it shook the mountain, it popped its cork, all this steam and ash started shooting out, going about 200 miles an hour. And this guy taking the pictures, he just escaped with his life. And it created huge, like, slurry type tornadoes, ash slurry type tornadoes, creating sedimentary layers of ash. And anyway, and then as a result, about 56 people died. Several went missing. And when I went to the first field trip in 1980 or 1990 by Steve Austin, they brought in a Christian guy who was part of the National Guard at the time when the mountain blew, and this National Guardsman, he came and he presented all these slides, and we got to see things that nobody else has ever gotten to see. And I'll never forget this, but he took pictures of people who had been hit by this steam explosion, by all this ash. And if I remember right, and I'm pretty sure I remember right now, that was back in 1990, but he took pictures of people that were hanging in trees that had been killed by the mountain, and they were literally hanging in trees, and they were basically cooked from the inside out because the temperature was so great. Anyway, here's other pictures of vehicles, cars, people that did not make it out alive. You notice this semi truck, it didn't come through very well. Buried. Mount St. Helens blew out enough material for everyone on Earth to have a ton. It would fill a 10 cubic yard dump truck every 24 hours per day for 600 years. Also, when the mountain blew, they calculated that, it erupted for 9 hours. And so that would have been an equivalent of 33,000 atomic bombs going off in a 9-hour period, and it would be 1 atomic bomb per second. And to think of the fact that this was a small volcano. This wasn't some big, huge volcano. It was a small one. And then here we have the steam explosion pits. Now this was really interesting because huge chunks of glacier from the mountain was blowing off, landed at the base of the mountain, and then ash and steam covered this ice and glacier material. And this ash was like, I believe it was, they calculated it to be like 300 degrees centigrade. So that'd be like around 600 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in there. And it began to melt all that ice. And what it did is it created what we call steam explosion pits, and it's kind of reminiscent, it's very similar to the Badlands that we find throughout America. And so we know when you go to the Badlands, you think, well, all those gullies and rills that you see in the Badlands, all the canyons and the hillsides and stuff, you might think, well, it took millions of years for all of that to erode away to look like what we see in the Badlands today. But actually, this only took a few hours. And the steam explosion pits, they're not there anymore. They now have been eroded away by another event. So a steam explosion pit was actually created by way of gravity, where dirt, mud was just slumping in, and so it created that gully rill topography. Then on March 19th, 1982, now this is about 2 years later, an eruption melted a large snowpack that had accumulated in the crater over the winter. The waters mixed with loose material on the slopes of the mountain created an enormous mud flow. In 9 hours, the mud flow carved an integrated system of drainages over much of the valley, had reopened to the way to the Pacific Ocean. The drainages included at least 3 canyons 100 feet deep. One was nicknamed the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle because it was 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Now, this is really quite fascinating to think about, because here we have a geologic laboratory that gives evidence of Noah's flood right here in the state of Washington at Mount St. Helens. So the eruption of Mount St. Helens gave us a geological laboratory with which to study Noah's flood. And so here we have now a canyon at the base of Mount St. Helens that looks very similar to the Grand Canyon, but the layers of the Grand Canyon was made by water slurries, whereas the layers that were laid down at Mount St. Helens were laid down by gas charged slurries. Hopefully that makes sense. And so anyway, so we have this next eruption in March 19th, 1982, where it melted all this snow and ice that it had accumulated on top of the mountain. So all this mud slid down the mountain, creating the Grand Canyon, or the Little Grand Canyon, in about a 9-hour period. Now, you can see that there are 3 major different layers here now in the Little Grand Canyon. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, when I went there to the Little Grand Canyon in 2012 with the field trip that was done by Dr. Steve Austin, it doesn't look quite like this anymore. You see, that's the thing. You people who've never been to Mount St. Helens yet, you need to go there and see it before it all turns back to normal, because things are not looking the same as they once did in 2012. In fact, here I want to show you the pictures of what it looked like in 1990. So here are pictures of what the 1990 field trip looked like, and then here are pictures of what the field trip of 2012 looked like. And things are changing. They're changing rapidly. And so if you don't get there and take a look at this place, you're going to miss out on a huge historical event that took place 40 years ago. And so here we have the side of the Little Grand Canyon, and you'll notice that there are 3 major layers. Now, let's start with the bottom layer. In May 18th, 1980, you can see the bottom layer here in this picture. So that was laid down by the May 18th, 1980 eruption. Now remember, this is this is air-charged slurries. This is volcanic ash and mud and all that came down from off the mountain that are creating these different layers at different... Then we come to the June 12th, 1980 eruption. And when we zero in on this layer, we notice that these layers are just super thin, very, very thin layers that were laid down by what they would call airfall tough, air-charged slurries. Okay, then you go to the March 19th, 1982 eruption. Now this was the eruption where all the mud slid down off the mountain and it carved out the Little Grand Canyon. Okay, so now let's look at this picture here, and you'll notice the real thin, like laminated layers, and this was laid down by way of ash, air-charged slurries. Get it right that time. Now take a look at this picture. Now this is really amazing. Now look at this picture. Notice the cliff. Notice the real thin layers. And then at the bottom of the cliff, it angles off. And you'll notice the person there for scale. Okay, now take a good look at that. Now look at this picture. Notice it's the same idea. So the first picture was of the Little Grand Canyon. The next picture is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And look at the cliff. Look at the layers. Look how thin they are. It compares very much with the Little Grand Canyon. So you have the cliff with the layers, and then it slopes off. And so all these layers that we're looking at the Grand Canyon, they were laid down by water, whereas the layers at the Little Grand Canyon were laid down by a volcanic eruption, ash coming down from the air. Okay, so now here's the next picture of the Little Grand Canyon. And you know, I can just see this 100 years from now. Some teacher's going to take their students through there to the Little Grand Canyon. They're going to say, look what tens of thousands of years did. Look at the little river that flows through the canyon did to carve out this Little Grand Canyon. Nope, that's not what happened, teacher. Actually, we were there to see this happen. And this happened March 19th, 1982, when all that mud slid down, and it carved out this canyon in about a 9-hour period. And so now we have the river running through there. So the canyon was not created by the river. Actually, the canyon gave a place for the river to flow. So we know that it was a catastrophe that created this canyon. Now, of course, you've got a lot of evolutionists and uniformitarianists that are doing damage control, trying to say that you can't make a comparison here. Well, in fact, you can, because when the Grand Canyon was carved out by a flood that was most likely after Noah's flood, all those layers in the Grand Canyon in Arizona were all mud-like layers too, and it was an upwarp. so the canyon, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, was called the Kaibab Upwarp, where water flowed through the upwarp, this huge sheets of water carving out that canyon. Okay, the point is the reason why I bring up the Kaibab Upwarp is because we know that a river cannot flow uphill. See, they're suggesting that the Colorado River carved out the Grand Canyon. No, it was a flood that carved out the Grand Canyon, and as a result of the Grand Canyon, the river flows through the canyon. So the river never carved out the canyon. Kind of getting ahead of what I wanted to say. But anyway, so here's the Little Grand Canyon. It's about 1,000 feet wide and 140 feet deep. And today, if you go there, it looks quite a bit different than it did back in 1990 when I went there to see it for the first time. And so anyway, this little river that's going through the Little Grand Canyon did not carve out that canyon. And the interesting thing is there were two other canyons that were carved out after the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. There's the Steep Canyon and there's Lowett Canyon. And both of these canyons were carved out overnight by some mysterious flood that I guess nobody really saw it happen, but it's like it happened overnight when nobody was looking, and voila, there's these two canyons, Lowett Canyon and Steep Canyon. And don't let people lie to you about this, because if you look at the internet, there's people that are trying to debunk this, and they're saying that, well, you know, it's not the same thing because this was soft material, it was crumbly already, and so it was easy for water to flow through here and create this canyon. No, actually, that is not true at all. This was hard rock. And that is what's making this so amazing. This water that flowed through there, this water and mud that flowed through there, carved through very hard rock. And as you can see the pictures here, that does not look like crumbly stuff. That is super hard rock. Okay? Now, we make the comparison here to the Little Grand Canyon to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And, you know, you look at this picture right here of the Grand Canyon, you can't hardly even see the Colorado River. But there it is. It's just, you can just barely see it. It's like a little sliver in a canyon. But there is the little tiny Colorado River. And they want me to believe that that little river carved out that huge canyon that's 18 miles wide and a mile deep. I'm sorry, I don't have that kind of faith. That is just plain stupid. I'm going to just have to say it. That is dumb. Okay, then when you look at the Grand Canyon, you'll notice all these layered like pancakes. It's layered like pancakes. And there's no erosion marks between any of those layers in the Grand Canyon. You see, if each one of those layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down slowly over millions of years, where there would be like millions of years between each layer, then I would expect to find an environment or an ecosystem between those layers. I would expect to see rivers and lakes, mountains and that kind of stuff between each one of those layers, and we don't find that. No, instead, it is laid down like pancakes. And so that is evidence that each one of those layers was laid down quickly over a short period of time, just like what we see at Mount St. Helens. And so when we go to Utah, we go to Canyonlands, and there are 3 lakes that they're ancient lakes. They're no longer there, but if you go to Canyonlands in Arizona, Canyonlands, there were 3 different ancient lakes that you don't see there anymore. But those lakes, they breached this dam, and this would have been just right after Noah's flood. And those lakes, they broke forth, they gushed out, creating the Grand Canyon. Just like the Little Grand Canyon, March 19th, 1982, when we had this huge mud flow coming off of Mount St. Helens, carving out the Little Grand Canyon. Another interesting thing I want to show you is that this is what happens once water starts to go over a dam. The erosion rate increases quickly. And so it can create canyons very quickly because water is the second most powerful force in the world. And so when you get a lot of water, it can just shoot out of its huge lake that was dammed up, and it can create mighty canyons. And you know, when you go to Yellowstone, you can go to Yellowstone Canyon, and that canyon, the walls of the canyon, is all made up of volcanic ash. And so we have a river now, Yellowstone River, that goes through this canyon. And I'm going to tell you, the river did not carve out that canyon. The canyon gave a place for that river to go.